Welcome to this presentation about submarine operations in the Cold War and my experiences during this time. As the title suggests, we are talking history here, and that includes me. But history has a habit of repeating itself. So much of what I say has relevance to today's submarine operations when Russia is once again asserting its naval strength in the ocean. My submarine career began in 1961 in a frigate, a couple of years after leaving Dartmouth College. My captain decided to pack me off to submarines, where he thought my somewhat informal approach to discipline might be better appreciated. So I was not a volunteer, but he was a very wise captain, and I found that the very high level of professionalism in submarines, coupled with a much less formal discipline, suited me well. In fact, there were a surprisingly large number of non-volunteers in my day as a consequence of the submarine service expanding very fast to meet the Soviet threat. But the glamour of saying I'm a submariner quickly made converts and volunteers of us all. So this is the story of myself and my fellow submariners in what was euphemistically called a Cold War, but in reality was very hot, even though no shots were fired, or rather not admitted to. An invariable first question is, did you get claustrophobia? Well, Spike Milligan's cartoons suggest we might have done, but patently we did not. But in the old diesel engine boats, which had been built in the closing days of World War II, we did manage to pack 70 people into a metal tube only 20 feet wide and 230 feet long, with only enough fresh provisions for a week, and after that, frozen or tinned food to last for the next 6 to 8 weeks. And we only had enough fresh water to have an all-over wash weekly, no showers. The 2 wash basins in this picture were for 50 men, half a basin full just once a week to clean your teeth, do a body rinse, and wash your socks. And I can tell you that getting the order right was quite important. And anyway, the words fresh water were a joke because the water we sailed with had to last for the whole patrol. So we all got somewhat dirty and smelly, but then we all smelt the same, a delicate mix of diesel oil, stale air, and old cabbages. We didn't wear proper uniform, just any old clothes known as steaming gear, and believe me, they steamed. This is the same space as in the last picture, where about 30 sailors ate, slept, and socialized for up to 8 weeks at a time. But some had to sleep in the passageway, the disadvantage of the bottom bunk being that if you were on the surface, there was a real danger of water coming down the conning tower, flowing along the passageway and over you in the bottom bunk. And my first bunk was the bottom one, and no one told me, of course. And this is the galley which produced 70 hot meals 3 times a day. It's about the size of a reasonable caravan kitchen. And here's where we kept the beer, also known as a torpedo tube. And lastly, this is the control room in the middle of the submarine, which is where, as the name implies, diving and keeping depth were controlled from. It's a sort of plumber's and electrician's nightmare. It was from here that navigation and attacks were conducted. The brass tube is one of 2 periscopes in its lowered position, and what was called the fruit machine can be seen in the background painted grey, with two dials, one above the other. The top one was the target and the bottom one was us. It was an electromechanical device. There were, of course, no computers in the early 60s, and it calculated the direction in which to fire torpedoes. At action stations, there could be as many as a dozen people in here conducting a well-orchestrated ballet. So the third question I'm always asked is, did you have any psychological selection tests or training to tolerate each other at sea in such close proximity? The answer is no. We learned to respect and tolerate each other because the safety of the boat, our very survival, depended on each other's skills. This trust was engendered because every crew member, from the most junior upwards, had been examined on their ability to put their hands on and operate any piece of equipment relating to the safety of the submarine, tested with blindfolds on or in the pitch dark. This cartoon hung in our training classroom ashore. We all had to become Sergeant Johnnies. So what were we actually doing when we dived on patrol in the Atlantic in our sardine tins? Well, on the 17th of October 1962, soon after joining my first submarine, this satellite photo was taken over Cuba, showing nuclear missile sites being installed with the capability of reaching the USA. It was the start of a tense standoff between the West and the Soviet Union. There was every chance it would cause a nuclear war. Fortunately, Khrushchev blinked. But just how close we came is shown by the following photograph. It shows one of 4 Russian submarines discovered in the prohibited area around Cuba, and it's been forced to the surface by US ships, which had dropped explosive charges to encourage it to surface. This was a very foolish thing to do. It could well have been interpreted as a depth charge attack. And we only found out in 1995 that the torpedoes on the Russian submarines had nuclear warheads and that they had permission to use them. Fortunately, the squadron commander, who was also in the boat in the photograph, had decided that he did not want to start World War III, and the submarine surfaced. From that time on, we took getting to know our enemy capabilities very seriously. The Cold War had begun in earnest. Rather like the great game played out between the British and Russians on the northwest frontier in Afghanistan in Victorian times, we were now playing our own great game with the Russians. And our Khyber Pass was the Greenland, Iceland, Faroes gap. Listening devices, known as SOSUS, were laid on the seabed to give a tripwire warning of Soviet boats passing through the gap. The RAF then flew out long-range anti-submarine aircraft, such as this one called a Nimrod, to the general area to localize the target. In fact, this aircraft was being flown by the now church warden at my Deddington church. The aircraft then handed the target over to us, who were lying in wait to the south of the Iceland-Faroes gap. We would close in to trail the submarine at close range, at anything from a few hundred yards out to a mile, to gather intelligence on where they went and what they did. Wherever they went on patrol, so did we, playing grandmother's footsteps behind them. Across the Atlantic, generally to the US seaboard, where they remained close to the US shore. Why close? Because they only had very short-range missiles at that time. And then we followed them back and waved goodbye as they went through the gap, heading back for home. The aim was to gather intelligence, but also to make them aware that we knew exactly what they were doing. We wanted to put them on edge, get into their heads, so they knew we were constantly in a position to attack if needed. The Soviets probably did not know if we were there, but just in case we were, they had one tactic that we called a crazy Ivan, in which they would suddenly turn round and accelerate straight back down their own track. You had to get out of the way very quickly to avoid a collision. Note that the winter ice line extends down through the gap. So the Soviet submarines in winter tried to avoid us by using the ice as a covert transit route. So we needed to be able to operate under the ice as well. In order to do this, my first submarine, HMS Auriga, was based in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, for 2 years, from where we could reach the ice line quite quickly. And here we are, entering an ice field, still on the surface, doing a final charge of our battery. To ensure that we had a full battery before we dived. And this is half an hour later, dived, looking through the periscope. Ice provides a good hiding ground because the high background noise conceals the noise of propellers and engines, and also the ice prevents detection by aircraft radar or satellites equipped with infrared and optical cameras. But it was very dangerous territory for a battery-driven submarine because we needed air periodically to run the diesel engines to recharge the batteries, either on the surface with a hatch open or via the snort mast. So we were constantly on the lookout for thin patches in the ice to do this. And more importantly, in case we had a fire or flood on board, needing us to surface in emergency. These thin patches of ice or open water are called polinias by the Russians, so we use the same word. This is a polinia looking vertically upwards from underneath, looking through the periscope. You can see the sun shining through. We surfaced in these polinias by blowing air into our tanks from well below the ice so that the strong upward momentum would be sufficient for the fin to break through. Traditionally, we then played cricket or football if it was thick enough, and you can just see two people going onto the ice to test it out. But it was not all hard work. The great thing about being on the west side of the Atlantic meant that we were conveniently close to nice places to visit. This is an iconic picture of a city you might recognize, taken in 1963 before the Twin Towers were built, and sadly, of course, no longer there now. I then served on a new Porpoise class of submarine from 1965 to 66, based in Scotland, HMS Sea Lion. It was fitted with bigger and better sonar listening devices located in the big bump on the bow. And there were sonar arrays listening hydrophones all the way along the hull underwater. This led to me becoming a specialist in underwater sound and how to carry out attacks from deep without using the periscope. Unlike surface ships, who transmit an active ping that tells them target direction and distance by the returning echo, ping, a submarine does not like to give itself away by pinging, so just listens. The problem is, you then don't know the distance away of a target, only the direction it lies in, which I can only describe as like walking through a field of cows in the dark. You can hear them, but not see how far away they are. Furthermore, sound does not travel in water in straight lines. The salinity of water, temperature and depth all affect the path that sound travels on. For instance, a temperature change point, as here, where it's gone from one temperature slightly warmer, then gone colder again, causes sound to bend away from the boundary and to bounce on it and away from the surface, always moving towards colder water. This causes ducts above the boundary layer in which sound gets trapped and can travel hundreds of miles, while below the boundary, sound bends downwards and disappears into the depths. And this creates a shadow zone in which a submarine can be located and not hear a ship above the boundary layer, and vice versa, the ship can't hear the submarine. We can also avoid detection by sitting on the bottom and pretending to be a rock. And we needed to know the topography of the bottom, because if you're at a depth like this and moving forward, and there happens to be an underwater hill in front of you, you really want to know about that. After 2 years in Sea Lion, I had a very welcome break from the cold North Atlantic and Scottish weather, and was sent off in 1968 to be second in command of HMS Catchlot, based in Singapore, hence the palm trees. Here there had been another type of war only recently come to an end, euphemistically called the Indonesian confrontation, in which the British had opposed President Sukarno's attempts to annex Borneo. Submarines had been used to land Royal Marine commandos at night to carry out clandestine operations, and we were still preparing and developing the skills to do this if necessary again. And what you're about to see is a short video starting inside the submarine in red lighting, which protects night vision and is less visible to the enemy, of canoes being pushed out of a hatch and then being launched into the sea. The submarine during this time is extremely vulnerable. If it's attacked and needed to dive, the hatch has to be unobstructed for as short a time as possible, so you can shut it immediately. You might even have to dive, leaving some people outside in order to save the rest of the crew. It's an extremely dangerous operation. Another technique that was pioneered by the former MP Paddy Ashdown, who was a Royal Marine in Singapore during the confrontation, was to place 2 canoes with 2 SBS soldiers in each on the casing, with the submarine stopped on the surface some distance offshore. This was a night operation, of course, so there are no photographs. The submarine then submerged beneath them, so they floated off as the submarine went down. And then we would move slowly ahead with the periscope raised to catch a rope the canoeists had strung between them, and then tow them with the periscope until much closer inshore, when we'd flash a torch into the eyepiece of the periscope, which the canoeists would see at the top before we pulled the scope down. And off they paddled on their own for however many hours or days their operation took. Incidentally, Frank Grenier, who drew these sketches, in real life, in the Indonesian confrontation, sent Paddy Ashdown off with the encouraging words that he was so sorry they would not be returning to pick him up, as they had further orders. Paddy's face was a picture, but of course another submarine was tasked to recover them, and they got home okay. And to recover them, the reverse procedure was carried out. We would arrive submerged at a prearranged rendezvous and catch the rope they had strung out again with our periscope, tow them out to sea, surface, and bring them back inside the boat. And here is a picture of them about to come on board, where they got a free glass of naval rum and much admiration for their effort. The other, even more challenging technique was to use swimmers with breathing equipment who would exit the submarine, which was stopped submerged, from the gun tower via a waterlock. The swimmers would make their way to the top of the fin using a rope to haul themselves up with. On this occasion, the operation was done as close inshore as possible, so they did not have too far to swim to their target. To recover them, they would float in the water at the rendezvous close inshore, making a noise with an underwater device called a trongle. Why a trongle? Because it made a distinctive triple beat we could hear easily, and they had a rope strung between them. Next, as you may have guessed by now, we caught a rope on the periscope, and they made their way down the periscope from the fin and into the gun tower and back into the submarine, where they got their very well-deserved tot of rum. Brave men all. In 1969, I returned to the UK to take the Commanding Officer's Qualifying Course, more commonly called the Perisher. So called because if you fail it, then your submarine career perishes. However, I duly qualified and was appointed to my first command, aged only 30, of HMS Alliance and her crew of 70 men. One of the attractions of submarines was the fact you got an early command. In this picture, we are entering Gibraltar for the first of many times in the next 2 years, because we were to spend a lot of time in the Mediterranean, tracking Soviet ships and submarines in much the same way that we had done in the Atlantic. But here, our Iceland-Faroes gap was in fact the Dardanelles, through which the Soviets would come from their various Black Sea ports to patrol in the Mediterranean. But as they had no friendly harbours to use, they anchored in shallow water bays on the North African coast instead. This enabled us to find them quite easily, of course, and so we would creep submerged into the anchorages where they were conveniently stationary to take intelligence pictures and recordings. But the trick was not to get caught up in their anchor chains, which could spoil your whole day. And also hope they did not see you in the very clear water as you passed below them. Just going back in time a bit, the RN had entered the nuclear age in the 1960s with the launch of HMS Dreadnought. Submarines changed shape from long and thin to short and porpoise-like for higher underwater speeds. The advantage of a nuclear submarine, of course, is unlimited power, with no need to refuel every time you return to harbour. In fact, the latest nuclear submarines don't have to renew their reactor cores ever. So submarines were now free of any need to breathe outside air. They made their own. They could remain submerged just as long as the food would last, and could roam anywhere unseen in the oceans of the world. This changed the face of naval warfare. It also changed how we lived. We now had unlimited hot water for showers and laundry, of course, and much more space. This is the wardroom mess, eating and recreation space for 15 officers. We had separate cabins for sleeping in, Note that we're wearing uniform because the photograph was taken in harbour, but at sea we would wear white shirts and dark blue trousers, so we did wear uniform of a sort at sea. The previous photo was taken on board HMS Repulse, the Polaris missile-carrying submarine I was appointed to be second in command of and for a time in command of. Notice the long flat deck aft of the fin, under which there were 8 pairs of vertical missile tubes. In each of the tubes was a missile 9.5 meters high and 1.3 meters wide. You can imagine, therefore, just how much of the submarine was underwater. Each of the 16 missiles were armed with 3 nuclear warheads, each one of which had the destructive power of 8 Hiroshimas. We had to fire a test missile in the US from dive on the Florida missile range. No nuclear warhead was fitted on it, of course. And this is it, leaving the water on its 2,500-mile journey to a remote spot in the Atlantic Ocean. Check clear of any shipping, of course. With a definitely non-US approved bulldog image stuck on the outside to identify it as British. Patrols on average were 2 months long. Apart from our professional duties, we also had to occupy ourselves socially, which revolved around films, quizzes, board and card games, education courses. Some people made models. There was an onboard newspaper with all the gossip from our own boat, of course. We got bored with what was happening in the outside world. And we were at sea over Christmas on one patrol when we staged our very own pantomime. But boredom could be a real problem. And on week 5 of another long patrol, boredom was definitely setting in and was bad for concentration. So I decided to do something that woke things up a bit. Yes, this is a scrubbing brush, and hereby hangs a tale, or a dit, as we call stories. So I attached a piece of string to my brush one Sunday morning after church and took it for a stroll down the main passageway through the accommodation space, saying good morning to people as I went. Reaction varied from "Morning, sir, nice day for a walk," and "What's his name?" to a bit more sharply, "Don't let him lift his leg on my newly scrubbed deck." As I said at the beginning, no special psychiatric training was needed. We're all very normal. No one was meant to know, of course, when we were to sail on patrol or to return, except for the fact that the firms that received the order to deliver fresh bread and meat the day before we sailed and on the day back must have had some idea. Departing was always a tearful occasion for the families. On my first patrol, though, I wondered why my wife was waving quite so hard until I put my hand in my pocket and found I had the car keys. The crew had no idea where we were or where we were going. Only the captain and the navigator ever knew. But our families could send us a weekly message, which consisted of only 40 words. It could not be in code or convey any bad news. But nonetheless, there was much excitement when you received your family-gram. This one tells me that a bee's nest had caused a problem and that Dougal the dog was somewhat unusually being good. On our side, of course, we could not send out messages or signals to anyone while on patrol because we had to remain undetected. This included if someone died. And yes, there was spare space for a couple of bodies in the deep freezer because we would not come off patrol for any reason. Some 2 years later, I was selected for promotion to commander and appointed to be commanding officer, known as teacher, to the famous Perisher course I had myself undergone some years previously. The course firstly assesses whether potential submarine captains can handle themselves and their submarines safely, even in dangerous situations. To do this, of course, we had to put them into dangerous situations, such as this one, which is a periscope photo of a frigate coming straight at the submarine, which has just carried out an exercise firing and is about to go deep so the ship will pass over the top. The main aim of Perisher, of course, was to teach commanding officers how to conduct attacks. And here we're carrying out a torpedo attack on a frigate, which is in fact about 1.5 miles away. And this is a periscope photograph I took shortly after one of the students had fired a torpedo. And this is the air bubbles coming up from the torpedo, which is about 300 yards away. Aimed ahead of the target, of course, because it takes time to travel to the distance. They would coincide about here. And the torpedo was set for safety reasons to run about 20 feet underneath the target. In 1982, in the Falklands War, the captain of HMS Conqueror attacked and sank the Argentinian naval ship Belgrano with exactly the same type of Mark 8 torpedo and in exactly the same way as in the previous photograph. And in fact, the Captain Chris Reeford Brown had been on Perisher during my time as teacher. My final seagoing appointment was in 1977 as captain of HMS Scepter, at the time Britain's very latest and shiningest nuclear-powered hunter-killer submarine, designed specifically to hunt down Soviet submarines. She was still being built at Barrow-in-Furness, so I could watch somewhat emotionally as my new command slid down the slipway. My main impression was just how big she was, tall as a 6-story building and a city block long, and all mine. And here we are heading off on patrol down the Clyde. She was exceedingly fast underwater. She held the world submarine speed record for a while at over 30 knots, and she could dive deeper than any other RN submarine at the time. At speed, she banked, climbed and dived, just like an aircraft, but without the barrel rolls or loops, of course. She was an underwater Spitfire. She was also the first RN submarine to have a fully computerized command and attack system. Unfortunately, the government forgot to build a trainer to teach us how to use it. So a very welcome set of visitors were 6 Wrens, female sailors, who came to sea for a week to help us do onboard training by feeding simulated contacts from portable computers into our main computer system. They were meant to go ashore and stay in a hotel each night on the Isle of Skye. But at tea time on day 1, the senior Wren came up to me and said, "What are you doing tonight, sir?" Realizing she was not propositioning me, I listened while she explained that rather than us doing nothing overnight, why did we not all stay at sea for the week and carry on training round the clock? So we did just that, and quite illegally anticipated the policy of women going to sea in submarines by some 40 years. We put the skills our Wrens had helped us to achieve to good operational use when tracking Soviet naval forces in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. But sometimes our submarines went right into the Russians' backyard by going north, round the North Norwegian Cape into the Barents Sea and right down to the Kola Peninsula operating areas in which the Soviets conducted their own exercises to gather further intelligence. We would monitor missile firings, intercept radio signals, take photographs, take underwater looks, and generally gather as much intelligence as we can. This is a Cannon-class destroyer going past. And this is a composite photo made up of several individual images taken through the periscope from underneath a Soviet submarine surfaced in a polynya in the ice. An interesting place to be if it then decides to dive. And sometimes we would get much closer, creeping up and adjusting our depth so the top of the periscope was just below the target's propeller. In this photograph, the top is about 8 feet from the propeller. It's a still from the video, which I'm just about to show you. This is a highly dangerous maneuver, as you can imagine, particularly if the submarine alters course or depth and you are slow to react. This is a photograph of HMS Talent coming off patrol as recently as 2015 with very obvious damage to her fin. The Navy said at the time that she had collided with an ice floe. In my time as a submariner, 2 Royal Navy and 9 US Navy boats had serious collisions with so-called icebergs. More serious, though, was the loss of the USS Scorpion in 1968, which sank 400 miles to the southwest of the Azores. There have always been unproven rumours that she was destroyed by a torpedo fired from a Soviet boat. At the end of my very exciting 2 years in command of SEPTA, and now age 40, so a bit too old for going to sea in a submarine again, I was sent to a desk job in the Ministry of Defence in Whitehall, where my office had a good view of the comings and goings of VIPs through the main entrance. After the excitement of chasing Russians, I quickly wearied of pushing paper, and forewarned that the Navy was about to undergo a massive reduction in size, I chose to leave the service and seek a career elsewhere before everyone else did. It was a good decision for me, and in due course I finished up as Marketing Director of the Westland Aerospace Group. So now I was a poacher turned gamekeeper, thereby completing careers on top of, below and above the surface of the ocean. If this talk has aroused your interest and you would like to know more about submarines, I can recommend 2 things. My first command, HMS Alliance, is preserved for visitors and open to the public at the Submarine Museum in Gosport. To visit her and walk through and experience the atmosphere is quite something. And if you have grandchildren or children as their teenage years, then they will find it particularly interesting. But as well as being a visitor attraction, she is also a public memorial to the 5,000 plus Royal Naval submariners who have died on active service. The second is a book. A well-known naval author, Ian Ballantyne, has written the story of the Cold War, seen through the eyes and personal experiences of 4 nuclear submarine captains, and I am one of those 4. It's not a novel, although some of the accounts of what we did read a bit like one. It frequently uses our own words to tell the stories and set them in the context of the political events of our unseen underwater Cold War. It may well contain the answers to any questions my presentation has raised. The book is available on Amazon or from myself for the price shown, £12.50 plus postage. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I do hope you've enjoyed it. If you wish to contact me directly to ask any questions, then please do so. And yes, I am wearing different clothes than at the start of my talk. The secret of success in the Cold War was to be unpredictable, and I guess old habits die hard. Thank you.